Welcome, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as ever, David Griscom. Hello, Dave.
Hey, friend.
And joining us, I'm very excited, Prem Thakker. He's a reporter at Zeteo News. There hasn't been many journalists who have very impressed me, I think, over the past, a year. Prem is definitely one of them. I'm really happy that Zeteo picked you up, Prem. Thanks so much for joining Left Reckoning.
It's great to be here. Thanks a bunch. Appreciate it.
Now, let's zoom in here on one of the topics you've been, at the White House press briefings asking questions about is Palestine, and zoom in very close to Hind Rajab, who, for folks who didn't see maybe the Hind Hall at the Columbia protests, or Malcolm Moore mentioned her, who is Hind Rajab, or who was Hind Rajab?
So Hind Rajab was a 6-year-old girl who in late January 29th, she was in a vehicle with her family members, and they were killed by Israeli forces. First, her family members were killed in front of her. Then her and her cousin were left in the car. There was this horrific emergency phone call that, some of you might have heard, where she and her cousin are just calling for help to the emergency authorities, the Palestinian Red Crescent. And they say out loud that, we see some tanks nearby, they're right in front of us. And then shortly thereafter, as medics are dispatched to save them, both Hind and her cousin, as well as the medics, are killed as well. The medics are killed on their way to rescue the two girls who were, again, trapped in a car, surrounded by tanks, as their family members were killed in front of them. So that happened on January 29th, and we just passed a pretty bleak milestone of just over 300 days since this killing happened. And since that time, there has been several outside investigations from, our press colleagues, from other just independent investigative organizations that have all sort of affirmed the basic conclusion that Israeli tanks were in the area, that it's very likely, if not assured, that those tanks were responsible for the killing. There was a UK-based organization called Forensic Architecture that said quite clearly that it was not plausible, as they said, that the Israeli tanks wouldn't have seen exactly who they were shooting at. With all of that in mind, given, again, it's been over 300 days since this killing, the Israeli government, in their preliminary investigation, which they still kind of maintain as of a couple of days ago, is that they didn't have a presence in the area, that they just weren't there. And so the logical conclusion that they don't explicitly say, but which is pretty directly implied, is that it wasn't them, that they just were killed in some other manner. So that's kind of the basic lay of the land. There's more to talk about, but I just to give you guys a broad sense before we get into the details of the 300 days sense.
Yeah, so, and, of course we know that it's not just Hind, but many children, and it's not just children, but many women and children, and not just women and children, but also men that are being killed indiscriminately by Israel there. But yeah, let's talk about over the course of the 300 days, maybe your expectations as a reporter trying to seek accountability on this issue and the resistance or, stone wall you faced.
Yeah, so to step back for a moment, when I and other journalists started asking about this in January and February, it was initially asked just as a, pretty horrific case, one that caught a lot of attention because of how widespread the emergency phone call footage was. It was one of those cases that, for whatever reason, stuck out, whether because of, a random algorithmic fluke or whatever, because there's so many horrors. This one stuck out for many, good reasons and valid reasons. And so initially, we were just asking about the case itself, what the U.S. government was hearing, how they were responding, how they were trying to learn more. But over the course of weeks, and as those weeks turned into months, it became clear that this embodied a lot of cases that we see of the Israeli government committing an alleged humanitarian law violation, is that they largely just get swept away in the mountain of increasing amounts of international law violations. Because over and over, as the question was asked, whether by me or by our colleagues in the press room, the answer would either stay the same or evolve in the most minute ways that suggested that there actually was no interface or pressure to get an answer to this question. And one thing that stuck out to me, and I think I got into this in one of the earlier months of asking this with the State Department, was, look, like, this is a case for which not only is it very well known across the world, there are sort of piles of evidence that one could use if they were serious about the investigation. There was the emergency phone call itself, which of course involves timestamps. It involves direct testimony of the victims. It involves emergency workers who are on the other end of the phone call. There was satellite imagery of exactly the exact place of where this incident allegedly took place. There's other individuals involved, whether it's other emergency workers and dispatchers and medical workers, as well as other Israeli soldiers who you could have checked as far as, where their deployment was at the time. And beyond that, that's just what was immediately available. And then you see a lot of, again, our colleagues in the press use other available evidence. There was I think it was Sky News, maybe it was someone else, that looked at, there's IDF press releases that showed that they were in the area at the time, despite the Israeli military saying that they weren't in the area. There's all these just pretty accessible breadcrumbs, if not just like explicit nuggets, that would help one determine what exactly happened, even if you had no sort of predisposed conclusion as to what that might be. And yet, over the course of those days and months, despite that fact, which we ourselves established with the government early on, it seems that there just wasn't an invective to I guess, follow that evidence for themselves. So one undercurrent sort of common denominator throughout the 300 days was that over and over again, when they did have an update from the Israeli government or what have you, they would preface it by saying, we haven't verified these claims, but this is what we've been told. Which is, okay, I'm glad you're saying that, but it's a pretty stark admission that even though this government is giving the Israeli government billions of US tax dollars unconditionally, not only is there not a condition of, like try not to bomb children in hospitals or kill a 6-year-old girl in a vehicle, it's that we won't even check your work when you tell us something. And so that's kind of been an undercurrent that's really embodied this case, but then tells us, okay, if this is how the US responds to such a well-known, globally well-known case of a girl for which we've heard her crying for help, how will they respond to 17,000 other kids who have been killed?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask, as somebody who's been very tenacious on this question, I mean, how does this, what does this sort of tell you, and what can you tell us about, the relationship between the United States government and Israel, on something like this? I mean, if you're regularly asking this question, and it seems like there's very little interest in giving any more information or even putting pressure on Israel. I mean, what does this sort of tell you as a journalist about, the relationship between our State Department and our government and the Israeli military and government?
I think for me, it reminds me that it isn't just appropriate to call this Israel's genocidal war in Palestine that's expanded into other countries. This is in the same way that, people may describe Hamas or Hezbollah as Iran-backed forces, Israeli forces, and this is not any sort of pejorative or value judgment. This is a factual matter that these are US-backed Israeli forces, and that it's not that the US is even just deferring to Israel as much as it is, perhaps as we see, for instance, Senator Lindsey Graham say this week that if you think this stops with just the ICC going after Israel and not going after the US, then you've got another thing coming. He's actually, revealing something, which is, I think, when you hear it at first, you think of that as maybe a sort of radical right-wing position. But in practice, whether it's about specifically this war or not, just the way in which the US has navigated, of course, many of its foreign policy relationships, but especially with regards to this war on Palestine, it's one that, it's been said over and over again that, yeah, it's complicit, yeah, it's contributing, but it in many ways is a part and party of this war, which then leads to a lot of other provocative questions with regards to the ceasefire negotiations and things of that matter, where one could imagine, oh yeah, like, the U.S., I think a lot of people, for when they're first getting acquainted with this issue, especially over this year, and they see, for instance, our or other journalists hard questions in the press room about, hey, like, what are you doing about this? What are you doing about that case, this humanitarian law violation, this incident in Palestine? Some say, oh, well, that's not necessarily just in the US's hands. And when you have these realities, when you have these statements from American politicians suggesting that the opposite, then you understand that, yeah, those questions are fair because the US is a much more active player in this than just being a funder or having an ally.
Yeah, that's kind of something I want to ask you about more on the media side of things. Very early on in the Biden administration, David and I remember having a discussion about this Karine Jean-Pierre, and I can't remember who the initial correspondent was, but these people, like, you should look at them like you looked at the correspondents or the press briefers in the Trump administration. They are there to spin you. They are there to lie. And what's amazing now is that is a redundant message. People get that. I don't need to say, look at these Democrat ones, they're just as bad, because as you've seen in person, the amount of inability to address facts is, I think, really astounding to people who maybe weren't expecting it.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, and I think that in some ways sort of removes me from what I understand is very obvious sort of frustration, if not much more passion towards a lot of these spokespeople. I totally get it, especially when we're asking kind of straightforward questions and we get these answers that seem to be anything but. But to your point, like, the job itself is to be an individual, to be a spinner, to be a figurehead, to be someone who can do damage control, to maneuver, what have you. And of course, ideally an open democracy where, journalists can ask these questions to people in power, which is good. But because of that, I mean, for me personally, it's just been, as someone who's relatively new to the briefing rooms and whatnot, and someone who's trying to learn from a lot of the older journalists in there and more experienced ones, is that, it's I personally cannot imagine being a spokesperson for the government. Generally, it's a hard job. Some of these people are quite good at being on the fly and improvising and whatnot, but particularly with policies like these, that for a lay person to be acquainted with them, again, throughout this past year, if you were to talk any random person in this country or anywhere, just through sort of basic realities that can be agreed upon as to what's going on, it's hard to spin those realities. It's hard to look outside, see that there's clouds, see that there's water coming down, and say it's not raining. And so, yeah, for me, being in the room, trying to ask these questions as much as I can, I just try to ask the questions as earnestly and sort of plainly as I can in terms of laying out exactly the basis of the question, where the contradictions are, and then however they answer is however they answer. The point is, as much as I can, to try to see, how they navigate and maneuver and answer question, and to get things on record, of course. But at another level, it's also just to make clear what exact contradictions we're dealing with. And of course, if I'm wrong about something, that's great. That's the point of asking questions. But that's kind of how I approach being there.
So I mean, in the course of these 300 days, have you felt that there might be any daylight between the U.S. government and the Israeli government? And also in terms of like the investigation, I know, it seems fairly definitive, but is there anything that's sort of, in the pipe to sort of be able to say fully and confidently, what happened here?
I mean, what's interesting to me is that, again, while it's been whatever, I suppose 302, 303 days at this point, I suppose whenever this publishes might be a bit more, there have been slight gradations in how the U.S. has answered these questions over time. At first, it was much more about expressing concern, urging Israel to investigate itself. After 100-something days, I forget exactly, is when they first said that, yeah, we've heard back from the Israeli government. They say, and this is again at a time where the U.S. said that they did not verify these claims, the Israeli government told us that they tried reaching out to the Palestinian Red Crescent and other UN bodies, other organizations, to cooperate with the investigation. Those bodies did not respond. And so I asked again, I think in that moment, you did not check these claims? And he said, yeah, no, that we didn't check. It's okay. So I think later that day or later that week, I reached out to the Red Crescent, and they pretty strongly refuted that account. They said, we've never been asked to cooperate with any investigation into this. That discrepancy was brought back. And again, it was kind of this flurry of days of non-answers, to the point that in recent weeks, they've chalked it to a factual dispute that they cannot speak to. And this dispute, again, is not even just about the killing itself, but about the investigation into the killing. So that's how sort of far removed we are from U.S. focus on the actual killing. That this sort of, again, if you were to say this to a layperson, this idea that this is a factual dispute, that seems a little outrageous in a sense. That sort of contradiction, confusion is not even on the killing. It's just on the matter of whether the Israeli government did or did not reach out to a specific body that it probably would have if it was taking an earnest investigation. And so the last thing I heard from the Israeli military this week, after sort of ping-ponging between a few different offices, was, again, that they maintain the preliminary investigation. It's been passed on to another office for a unit that looks into, I believe they said, quote, unusual incidents. And that's sort of where it's been left off. And so in terms of specifically just on this investigation with regards to daylight, with regards to shifts, with regards to any sort of meaningful trajectory one way or another in terms of finding the truth, on the US end, it doesn't seem that has shifted that much materially. And consequently, specifically with regards to the Israeli government's interest in investigating this, it doesn't seem to have gotten far either.
I mean, I gotta think that probably we have that area under pretty good surveillance, and deep down somewhere in the Pentagon have a decent idea what happened. But Prem, are you going to be in the press briefing room under the Trump administration, and how are you going to formulate your questions to Press Secretary Alex Jones?
Yeah, I mean, I plan to be there just as steadfast as I was the past year. I think the whole ethos of I mean, as much as I try to in my work with the Zeteo, with the places I've worked before, like the Intercept and New Republic, is just, equal opportunity questioner. There's no sort of partisan preference one way or another in terms of these people need to answer tough questions. They're paid for by our neighbors and us to do their job, to serve the people in this country, and by virtue of being the most powerful country in the world in many respects, their actions impact, as we've seen, millions of people across the world. So in the same way that I try to be very earnest and straightforward and just open with my questions right now, I hope to be in the next administration too. Obviously, there's just as many, if not more, social, political, material, economic contradictions that this next administration will carry in advance. So plan to do the same.
Well, people should definitely, if you're not already, follow Prem on X. You on Blue Sky as well, Prem, and follow Zeteo News. There's a lot of folks in that room have been asking really good questions, but I always appreciate your contributions particularly, and I can't imagine how frustrating it is when the response is like, "Well, there's no evidence between Israel and Hamas regards to thanks for that meaningless response." But Prem, thanks so much, man.
Thank you.